The development context of Hotel Barcelona is fascinating, starting as a casual idea that turned into an epic collaboration between two masters of Japanese indie gaming, Hidetaka Suehiro, known as Swery, and Goichi Suda, or Suda51. It all began in October 2019, during an event called Travis Monday Nitro 2 in Shibuya, Tokyo, where the two were just chatting about creating a side-scrolling horror game. At that moment, it was more of a bar promise with no real commitments, but the title Hotel Barcelona was already announced right there, taking everyone by surprise. Shortly after, at an event in Canada, they met again and, during a dinner, Suda51 confirmed he wanted to take it seriously, sketching out the initial outline of the game. Personally, I find this incredible because it shows how great projects are born from unpretentious conversations. I imagine the two of them laughing with crazy ideas, mixing their eccentric visions, and suddenly, boom, a game that promises to be a bloody tribute to 80s horror. As a fan of games that mix deep narrative with innovative mechanics, I see this as a lesson that creativity doesn't need bureaucracy to flourish. All it takes is a spark between brilliant minds like these. The team behind Hotel Barcelona is from White Owls, the studio founded by Swery, and they brought in the team that worked on The Missing Macfield and The Island of Memories to bring this to life. Development began with a focus on creating a side-scrolling action game with horror elements, inspired by classic films like The Blair Witch Project and Wrong Turn, but with touches of bizarre humor typical of Suda51. They decided the game would be set in a luxurious, isolated hotel in the Appalachian Mountains near Pittsburgh, a choice that came from research on dense forests in North America and personal influences, like a friend of Swery's from Pennsylvania and films like The Dead Don't Die. In my personal opinion, this collaboration is like a dream for those who enjoy cult games. Swery brings his narrative depth and emotional loops, while Suda51 injects that pop madness and stylized violence. I love how they didn't limit themselves to a pure genre. Instead, they merged roguelite with Metroidvania, creating 7 worlds within the hotel, each with bosses inspired by horror subgenres like slashers or zombies. This makes me think the game is a love letter to the tropes of horror cinema, but with a layer of hilarious self-criticism that only these two could deliver. Challenges in development included balancing high difficulty with accessibility, adding an easy mode for those who want to enjoy the story without suffering so much. The game expects you to die and try again, with branching paths, power-ups, and weapons like surgical knives or Molotov cocktails, all inspired by death game loops, but focusing on actions instead of items. Swery wanted to embed the looping in the action itself, not just in exp, which required fine-tuning so that the phantoms would help without trivializing the game. In my personal view, this reflects Swery's genius in subverting expectations. Instead of punishing the player, the system rewards persistence, making each run a collective evolution of past selves. I imagine the team debating for nights on end about how not to make this overpowered, and the result seems to be a balance that rewards growing skill, like in Super Mario Bros., but with gore and a deep narrative. As someone who plays a lot of retro games, I see echoes of classic side-scrollers, but elevated by this innovation, making Hotel Barcelona stand out in a sea of generic roguelites. I feel that Swery and Suda51 put pieces of their eccentric personalities in there, creating not just a game, but a statement about horror as entertainment, and I can't wait to play and see how my own deaths help me win. It's the kind of development that inspires creators like me to dream big, mixing crazy ideas into something timeless. The premise is a bloody parody of 80s slasher horror films, set in a luxurious hotel on the outskirts of Pittsburgh, on the border between Pennsylvania and West Virginia, bringing together the most evil serial killers in the United States. And I love how it satirizes American horror in an exaggerated way, almost as if it were a gamer version of a B-movie with an indie budget. Personally, what captivates me is this vibe of dark humor mixed with stylized violence, something that Suda51 does like no one else, making the game not just an adventure, but a fun critique of the pop culture of cinematic killings. Deep down, Hotel Barcelona seems like a distorted love letter to the genre, and I imagine it will attract fans of narratives that don't take themselves seriously, but deliver deep layers of madness. The story revolves around Justine, a rookie federal marshal who wakes up in this cursed hotel after a car accident and suddenly finds herself possessed by the spirit of a serial killer named Dr. Carnival, who lives inside her as a guiding voice. Or rather, an insane voice that helps her channel forces to survive. I find this duality fascinating because it turns Justine into a divided anti-heroine, fighting not only against external enemies, but against her own corrupted mind, which reminds me of those psychological thrillers where the villain is part of the protagonist, and personally, I love how this adds layers of tension and unintentional humor. The hotel itself is a labyrinth of 7 scenarios inspired by horror classics like dark campsites a la Diamond Lake campsite, filled with serial killers, alien entities, and even sharks with AI, forcing Justine to navigate through infinite time loops where each death takes her back to the beginning, but with ghosts of her past versions helping out. Personally, this time loop mechanic excites me because it elevates the narrative from a simple slasher to something roguelite, where repetition is not punishment, but a narrative tool that builds a story of persistence and accumulated madness, as if the game were saying, die and learn but with style. In the plot, the goal is to exterminate all the evil killers to escape, but with Dr. Carnival whispering sadistic advice, the journey becomes an explosive and wild carnage. And I confess that I see potential for hilarious moments, like Justine arguing with her possession while cutting enemies in half. This plot seems to me like a perfect mix of horror and comedy, and I would bet it will deliver plot twists that question the sanity of everyone involved, including the player. The cinematic influences are the heart of Hotel Barcelona's story, parodying classic slasher films with a touch of Japanese exaggeration. And I personally see this as a fond and mocking tribute to works like Halloween or Friday the 13th, but with killers gathered in a hotel as if it were a macabre convention. Sweary and Suda51 infuse pop references like sharks with AI or aliens, creating a journey through the history of horror that goes from serial killers to sci-fi monsters. And I find it hilarious how this transforms the plot into a caricature of the desensitized violence of Western media, something Suda51 loves to explore. Personally, what captivates me is the balance between beautiful and brutal. The 2.5D visuals are stylized, with blood gushing and colorful explosions, but there's a poetic beauty in the psychedelia, as if the hotel were a fashion purgatory for killers. The narrative satirizes the genre by having Justine, possessed by Dr. Carnival, question her own morality while clearing the place of threats. And I imagine scenes where humor arises from absurdity, like debating ethics with a ghost while fighting a robot shark. This parody seems to me a subtle critique of the glorification of violence in films, but with a light tone that avoids being preachy. And I love how it allows for the player's personal opinions on what is evil in this crazy universe. Overall, the story uses these influences to build a cohesive but chaotic world that I believe will resonate with those who enjoy horror with a comedic twist. In the end, the story of Hotel Barcelona leaves me with a mixed expectation of excitement and curiosity, because it's a game that seems to be as beautiful as it is brutal, with a narrative that uses time loops to question human persistence in the midst of chaos. And personally, I think it will be a hit for those who, like me, love mixtures of horror, humor, and innovative mechanics. Justine and Dr. Carnival form a dynamic duo that could yield memorable dialogues, and the hotel as a central setting fascinates me for being a microcosm of parodied American horrors, which I see as an opportunity for personal reflections on violence in pop culture. I imagine the game will attract a niche audience, the kind that plays Deadly Premonition repeatedly. And I confess that, in my opinion, if they get the balance between roguelite and plot right, it could become an instant cult classic. The delay to 2025 makes me a little impatient, but I'd rather wait for something polished than a rushed release, especially with such visionary creators. Personally, what excites me most is the potential for narrative replayability, where each death adds layers to Justine's story, making it an intimate and chaotic journey. The graphics of Hotel Barcelona impress me right away with their 2.5D approach that mixes side-scrolling elements with a visual depth that gives a sense of layers, as if the game were playing with perspectives from old horror films. In my opinion, this creates a unique atmosphere where the scenarios feel alive and oppressive, with hotel corridors that extend into blurred backgrounds full of shadows and subtle details that evoke horror classics from the 80s and 90s. I love how the developers opted for a color palette reminiscent of worn-out VHS tapes, with saturated tones of blood red contrasting with cold blues and deep blacks, which makes each scene pulse with a gory and nostalgic energy. Personally, I think this visual choice not only pays homage to the slasher genre, but also elevates the game to something artistically daring, making it visually addictive for those who, like me, enjoy a grindhouse aesthetic. It's as if the game were inviting me to dive into a stylized nightmare, and I can't resist this immersion. Speaking specifically of the blood and particle effects, the graphics shine in a visceral way, with blood gushing in fluid animations that cover the screen and the character dynamically, changing their appearance in real time. I think this is brilliant because it turns gore into a mechanical visual element that affects the player's perception. The more blood, the more vibrant and intense the tones become, as if the game were evolving visually along with the protagonist's madness. In my personal view, these effects are not gratuitous. They add a layer of aesthetic urgency, with drops running down the screen and stains that persist, creating a beautiful contrast between the bloody chaos and the clean designs of the enemies, who look like they came out of B-horror movies. I feel personally drawn to how this reflects a creative opinion from the creators, like Swery and Suda51, who seem to be saying horror is beautiful when it's exaggerated. And this makes me want to play just to see how the explosions of red color interact with the dark and labyrinthine environments. The character and enemy designs in Hotel Barcelona are, for me, one of the highlights of the graphics, with models that mix caricature and realism in 2.5D, giving them a striking silhouette that stands out against the backgrounds. I think the protagonist Justine, with her appearance of a federal marshal trapped in hell, has a fluid and expressive animation that conveys emotion through poses and movements, while the enemy serial killers, like the guy with a baseball bat, have grotesque and exaggerated designs that seem inspired by slasher film icons. Personally, this captivates me because it creates a visual narrative without words, where each enemy is a piece of horrendous art that evolves with the phantom effects. These ghostly clones that replicate past actions in ethereal and translucent tones. As for the environments, the graphics of Hotel Barcelona perfectly capture the essence of a cursed hotel, with sections inspired by horror films, each with visual variations ranging from decadent corridors to rooms full of luminous traps. I feel that the backgrounds are meticulously detailed, with textures that suggest decay. Cracked walls, broken furniture, and dynamic lighting that casts dramatic shadows, creating a sense of constant visual exploration. Personally, I think this elevates the game beyond a simple side-scroller, because the branching paths allow for the discovery of subtle graphical variations, like flickering light effects or fog that obscures parts of the screen, which makes me think about how the graphics serve the narrative of madness. The special effects, like the carnival awakening and attack explosions, are rendered with a quality that leaves me speechless, with particles and glows that fill the screen without compromising fluidity. I opine that this is what makes the graphics so personal and impactful. They are not just beautiful, but respond to the player's style of play, with the skull meter filling up visually in pulsating red tones that culminate in an explosion of color and chaos. Personally, I love how this contrasts with the simplicity of the initial levels, evolving into something more complex and visually overwhelming as phantoms join in, creating layers of overlapping animations that look like a symphony of pixelated horror. For me, who loves games with a retro-modernized aesthetic, this is a delight, as it evokes memories of old arcades but with a current polish that makes the graphics stand out on consoles like PS5, where the resolution and details shine even more. The gameplay of Hotel Barcelona captivated me right from the start, with its roguelike loop mixed with 2.5D side-scrolling action, where you control Justine, a federal marshal trapped in a cursed hotel full of serial killers, and you have to hack and slash your way through procedurally generated levels, dying and restarting to progress. I think this structure is brilliant because it turns every death into a learning opportunity, with short but intense runs that last for minutes, encouraging you to try again immediately, like in games such as Dead Cells, but with a parodic horror twist that adds a layer of dark humor. Personally, I love how the game doesn't punish you severely for failure. Instead, it rewards you with phantoms from past runs that fight alongside you, creating a sense of collective progression that makes me feel like I'm building an army of my failed selves. And that's addictive for someone like me who spends hours on roguelikes analyzing patterns and strategies for YouTube videos. The controls are responsive, with a dash, double jump, and light and heavy attacks that flow well, but I feel the light combo is a bit long and stiff, which forces me to plan my moves precisely to avoid being caught off guard by armed enemies. And in my opinion, this adds a delicious tension that elevates the gameplay beyond a simple button masher. At the core of the gameplay is the bloody combat system, where you constantly need to spill enemy blood to bathe in it and gain temporary buffs to strength, speed, and a skull meter that, when full, activates the Carnival Awakening, a devastating attack that clears the screen of enemies with a gore explosion. I think this is what makes Hotel Barcelona so unique and personally exciting. It forces an aggressive approach, with no room for hesitation, because the blood dries quickly and you lose the powers, creating an urgency that reminds me of Bloodborne, but with a comedic slasher film tone from the 80s. Personally, I have a lot of fun with this mechanic, as it turns combat into a chaotic dance of melee and ranged attacks, where parrying and blocking are essential to counter hordes of killers with baseball bats or hockey masks. And I love how the game rewards barbarity. The more limbs you sever, the more powerful you become, which makes me laugh out loud while playing, imagining how this would make a hilarious script for a review video. The heavy attacks, despite being slow, are perfect for breaking shields, and in my view, the balance between light and heavy encourages experimentation with unlockable weapons like kitchen knives or chainsaws, making each run an opportunity to test builds that suit my aggressive and impatient style. One of the mechanics that impresses me most in the gameplay is the Phantom Slasher, where after dying, a phantom version of yourself reappears in the next run, replicating the exact movements and attacks of the previous attempt, acting as a decoy and damage support, and you can accumulate up to 3 phantoms to form a spectral team. I opine that this is revolutionary because it turns death into a strategic tool. You can intentionally die on a specific path to create a phantom that distracts bosses or clears random enemies, adding a layer of planning that goes beyond the standard roguelike. Personally, this fascinates me, as it allows me to play creatively, like positioning my current self behind a phantom to use it as a shield while I attack from a distance, or luring enemies into the phantom's paths to maximize chaos. And I've already caught myself laughing at how my past mistakes become allies, something no other game I've played has captured so well. In my experience, this makes boss fights like Jacob with his hockey mask less frustrating and more collaborative, and I think it's perfect for speedrunners or streamers, as it encourages perfect runs with optimized phantoms, and I can't wait to record sessions where I show how to turn the game around with these ethereal clones. The level structure in Hotel Barcelona is based on branching paths that you choose on the map, each door leading to rooms with rewards like attack boosts, healing items, or challenges that vary with each run, mixing exploration with intense combat and surprise elements like enemies hidden in bushes. I feel this gives a tactical freedom that enriches the gameplay, allowing you to plan routes based on what you need, like going to a speed room if you have slow builds. And in my opinion, this is what keeps the game fresh, avoiding the monotonous repetition of linear levels. Personally, I appreciate how the design encourages replayability, with random weather-affecting conditions, like slippery rain or obscuring fog, which forces me to adapt strategies in real time, and this reminds me of roguelikes like Hades, but with a greater focus on comedic horror that makes every choice a bloody joke. As a content creator, I see huge potential for lists of best routes or analyses of how branching affects the metagame, and I love how it balances fair difficulty with progression, where practice leads to mastery without excessive grinding. As for weapons and progression, the gameplay offers a vast skill tree and unlockable weapons that you customize between runs, allowing for builds ranging from fast melee-focused to ranged with blood buffs. And I think this adds a customizable depth that makes the game suit your style. In my personal view, the system is empowering because, even if you die a lot at the beginning, you accumulate resources for permanent upgrades, like stronger phantoms or better combos, which motivates me to persist instead of getting frustrated. I feel drawn to experimenting with absurd weapons, like a chainsaw that cuts everything to pieces, and I opine that this captures the parodic spirit of the game, turning the gameplay into a celebration of B-movie absurdities, where I can dress Justine in ridiculous outfits like a cheerleader while massacring monsters. Personally, this amuses me immensely, as it breaks the seriousness of other roguelikes, and I imagine hours spent optimizing builds for specific challenges, something that aligns perfectly with my hobby of analyzing mechanics in videos. Expectations for PC performance are particularly encouraging, especially considering it's an indie title with roguelite mechanics and 2.5D side-scrolling action, developed by Swery and Suda51. I believe the PC will shine here because it allows for custom settings, which is essential for a game that mixes horror elements with intense combat and death loops that demand precision. According to the minimum specifications, an Intel Core i5 to 1300F is required, but the developers recommend something like an i7 to 1265 UE for optimized performance, which suggests the game isn't overly demanding on hardware, but can benefit from more robust GPUs to maintain stable frame rates above 60 FPS at high resolutions like 4K. In my opinion, this is a huge advantage for players like me, who prefer to adjust graphics to prioritize fluidity, avoiding FPS drops during bloody combat sequences and encounters with bosses inspired by 80s horror films. I imagine that with a mid to high-end setup, the game will run as smooth as silk, with no noticeable stuttering, especially since the art style doesn't seem to demand ray tracing or ultra-complex effects, which gets me excited to test it on my personal setup, where I prioritize stability over over-the-top visuals. However, if the hardware is older, it may be necessary to reduce settings to keep up the pace, which, in my view, doesn't compromise the chaotic and fun essence of the game, but reinforces how the PC offers flexibility that consoles don't always have. Moving on to the PS5, Hotel Barcelona's performance seems to be impressively optimized, with support for 4K Ultra HD and DualSense vibration, which adds an immersive layer to the horror and action moments. I personally love how the PS5 handles indie titles like this, maintaining a consistent 60 FPS or more in side-scrolling games, and I think it will be no different here, given the mentioned optimization for new-gen consoles. The 4K gameplay trailer suggests sharp visuals and fluid animations, with no signs of slowdowns, which makes me think the game will run flawlessly on the PS5's hardware, especially with the fast SSD reducing loading times between death loops, something that, in my experience with similar games, turns frustration into addictive fun. In my opinion, what makes the PS5 ideal for Hotel Barcelona is the integration with the controller, where the vibration can enhance the impacts of Dr. Carnival's attacks, making the battles against serial killers more tactile and intense, something I value greatly in long gaming sessions. However, if there are any limitations, it might be in scenarios more crowded with enemies, where the console could prioritize resolution over frame rate. But I doubt this will happen, as the 2.5D style doesn't seem to overload the system like an open-world game would. Overall, I would recommend the PS5 for those looking for a plug-and-play experience without technical worries, and I look forward to seeing how the game behaves on my PS5, possibly exceeding expectations in terms of stability. On the Xbox Series, Hotel Barcelona's performance is highlighted as optimized for the platform, with support for 60 FPS and 4K Ultra HD, which genuinely impresses me with the consistency that Microsoft offers in cross-gen titles like this. I think the Series X will be the king here for those who prioritize raw power, as the hardware allows for high resolutions without compromising fluidity, especially in a game with roguelite mechanics that involve rapid repetitions and chaotic combat. The information indicates that it is optimized for the series, which suggests minimal loading times and stable frame rates, something that, in my view, is crucial for not breaking the rhythm during fights against hordes of slasher-inspired enemies. I imagine that on the Series S, which is more accessible, the game will still run well at 1080p or 1440p at 60 FPS, but perhaps with some graphical cuts to maintain performance, which doesn't bother me, as I prioritize gameplay over visual perfection in indies. In my opinion, the online multiplayer for up to 4 players will greatly benefit from this optimization, avoiding lag in co-op sessions, and I wonder how this will make runs more fun with friends, without the technical interruptions that poorly optimized games bring. In the end, the Xbox seems like a solid choice for those in the Microsoft ecosystem, and I would personally opt for it if I wanted fluid crossplay with PC. Comparing performance between PC and consoles, I would say that the PC offers the most versatility for Hotel Barcelona, allowing for fine-tuning that can push the game beyond 60 FPS on high refresh rate monitors, something that personally appeals to me as a content creator who records gameplay at high resolutions. However, consoles like the PS5 and Xbox Series provide a more standardized and hassle-free experience, with optimizations that guarantee a consistent 60 FPS, which is perfect for those who don't want to deal with drivers or settings. In my experience, this avoids initial frustrations and allows you to dive straight into the madness of the haunted hotel. I think the PC might suffer from variations depending on the hardware, like stuttering on weaker setups, while consoles maintain a high baseline, especially with features like Quick Resume on Xbox, which facilitate breaks in long runs. Personally, I prefer the PC for experimentation, but I admit that the PS5 might fare better in terms of tactile immersion, making the horror moments more palpable. Overall, the game seems well adapted to all platforms, without major discrepancies, which reflects the developer's care in an indie title, and I'm excited to test it on multiple setups to see where the performance truly shines. Hotel Barcelona has the potential to be a standout in cross-platform performance, especially for an indie game with innovative mechanics like the Phantom Slasher, which requires precision without lag. I would recommend the PS5 for fans of Sony exclusives who value immersion, the Xbox for those who want seamless multiplayer, and the PC for total customization. On my channel, I plan to test all of them to compare real FPS post-launch. I think the game will run better than expected, avoiding common indie problems. Buying at launch has its pros in my view. You get in on the community wave, discuss theories about the psychedelic plot and weapon upgrades, almost 100 options to unlock, and avoid spoilers that inevitably pop up on the internet. I love that pioneering feeling, especially with indie titles like this, where the co-op multiplayer for up to 4 players can turn into chaotic and fun sessions with friends right at the initial hype. However, based on what I've played, the combat is challenging and fair, but with a steep learning curve that rewards retries. Something that excites me, as it reminds me of roguelikes like Dead Cells, but with a grindhouse horror twist. Also with a price around $29,999, it's a relatively affordable price for a launch. However, if you're more conservative, it might be good to wait a bit, like a couple of weeks after launch, to see if the game delivers on its promises without technical frustrations. This game is mainly recommended for fans of hardcore roguelites who enjoy high replay value with skill builds and phantom allies that evolve with each death. If you like stylized horror, inspired by VHS slashers like Friday the 13th, and don't mind a difficulty that punishes mistakes but rewards mastery, you'll have fun. Personally, I see it as perfect for those looking for something creative and bloody, mixing side-scrolling action with cooperative elements, ideal for nights of grinding with friends or streams full of jump scares and laughter.
Ha ha ha!